She smiled as she shredded my pilot uniform. 5 years later I had her badge in my hands, and this time I was the one smiling. Some betrayals demand sky-high revenge. The fluorescent lights in Northwest Aviation's crew locker room buzzed like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the polished metal surfaces. At 5:47 a.m. on what should have been the most important day of my life, I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at what remained of my dreams scattered across the cold linoleum floor. My navy blue pilot uniform. The one I'd saved 3 paychecks to buy, the one I'd pressed with trembling hands the night before, the one that represented 23 years of dreaming and 4 years of relentless training, lay in methodical, deliberate tatters. This wasn't accidental damage. This was surgical destruction. The blazer had been sliced from collar to hem, the fabric strips hanging like deflated hopes. The crisp white shirt was shredded beyond recognition, buttons scattered like fallen stars across the floor. But it was the wings. Those beautiful silver wings I'd earned through sleepless nights studying aerodynamics and meteorology, through countless simulator hours and check rides that left me drenched in nervous sweat. That broke something fundamental inside me. They were gone. Cut clean off with what looked like industrial scissors, leaving only jagged holes where my proudest achievement should have been. "Your early little sister." The voice came from behind me, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. I turned slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure everyone in the building could hear it. There she stood, Victoria Martinez, my older sister by 4 years, leaning against the row of lockers with the casual arrogance of someone who just committed the perfect crime. At 31, Victoria commanded respect wherever she went. Her dark hair was pulled back in that severe bun that made her look like she could stare down a Category 5 hurricane. Her captain's uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp enough to cut glass, the 4 gold stripes on her sleeves catching the harsh fluorescent light like badges of honor. She'd been flying commercial jets for Northwest Aviation for 8 years, accumulating over 12,000 flight hours and a reputation as one of the most reliable pilots in their fleet. But standing there in that locker room, surrounded by the evidence of her sabotage, she looked like something else entirely. She looked like a predator. "Victoria," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the humming lights and the distant sound of ground crews preparing for the morning departures. "Why would you? How could you?" The words died in my throat. What do you say when the person who taught you to love flying is the same person trying to destroy your chance to soar? "You're not flying today, Elena," she interrupted, her tone as cold as the morning air seeping through the building's ventilation system. Her dark eyes, the same color as mine, the same eyes that had watched planes together from our childhood bedroom window, held no warmth, no sisterly affection, only calculation. "You're not flying above me. Not today. Not ever, if I have anything to say about it." I dropped to my knees, my hands shaking as I tried to gather the fabric pieces. Each torn strip felt like a piece of my soul being ripped away. The weight of 4 years of aviation school, of working double shifts at the diner to pay for flight training, of studying until my eyes burned and my head pounded. All of it reduced to garbage on a locker room floor. "I know what you're thinking," Victoria continued, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she'd used since we were children. "Poor Elena, always the victim. Always so emotional. Always so fragile." She stepped closer, her shadow falling over me like a storm cloud. I could smell her perfume. The same expensive scent she'd worn since college, the one that used to make me feel safe when she'd hug me goodbye before her flights. Now it made me nauseous. "Do you know what Captain Morrison said when I told him about your panic attacks during training?" she asked, crouching down so her face was level with mine. "He said he'd been worried about exactly that. Said young pilots these days are too emotionally unstable for the responsibility." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. "What panic attacks? I never had." "The ones I witnessed during your simulator training," she said smoothly. "The ones where you hyperventilated during the emergency landing procedures. The ones where you froze up during the engine failure scenarios." Each lie hit me like a physical blow. I'd never had panic attacks during training. My simulator scores had been consistently above average. My instructors had praised my calm under pressure, my ability to think clearly during emergency procedures. But sitting there on that cold floor, surrounded by the ruins of my uniform, I realized that none of that mattered. Victoria's word carried more weight than my performance record. "You don't understand what it means to be responsible for 300 lives," she continued, standing back up and smoothing down her perfect uniform. "I've been holding this company together for 8 years. I've prevented disasters, saved lives, maintained safety records that keep this airline profitable and passengers confident. And now you want to waltz in with your straight-A certificates and your fresh-pressed dreams, thinking you deserve to share that responsibility." The locker room door opened with a sharp metallic screech that made us both look up. Captain James Morrison stepped inside, and I felt my last hope crumble like sand. Morrison was a legend in the aviation world. Former Navy pilot, 43 years of flying experience, the kind of man whose very presence commanded respect. I'd met him during orientation 3 weeks ago, where his handshake had been firm and his eyes had seemed kind. He'd even smiled when I told him about my childhood dream of becoming a pilot, about watching planes from our backyard and knowing I belonged in the sky. Now, those same eyes swept over the scene. Me on my knees surrounded by uniform scraps, Victoria standing nearby in her pristine captain's attire, and something hard and final settled in his expression. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't investigate. He simply looked at Victoria, who gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, then looked down at me with what could only be described as disappointment. "Briefing in 30 minutes, Captain Martinez," he said to Victoria, his voice carrying the professional courtesy reserved for respected colleagues. Then his gaze fell on me, and his tone changed completely. "Miss Martinez, please report to HR after you've cleaned this up." He turned on his heel and left without another word, the door swinging shut behind him with the finality of a judge's gavel. The sound echoed through the locker room like the death knell of my aviation career. Victoria watched me for another moment, her lips curling into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. 8 years, Elena. 8 years I've been protecting this company from pilots who aren't ready for the responsibility. Did you really think I'd let family sentiment interfere with passenger safety? My phone buzzed in my pocket. With trembling fingers, I pulled it out and read the notification that made my blood freeze. "Flight crew reassignment. Report to ground operations immediately. Your pilot assignment has been cancelled pending psychological evaluation." Just like that, my pilot career was over before it had begun. I stared at the screen, willing the words to change, to reveal themselves as some kind of cruel joke. But the message remained, cold and clinical and absolutely final. 23 years of dreaming, 4 years of intensive training, $127,000 in student loans, and countless sacrifices. All erased by a few lines of corporate text. "How?" I whispered, looking up at Victoria. "How did you?" "It's amazing what people will believe when it comes from a trusted source," she said, checking her watch with casual indifference. "Captain Morrison has enormous respect for my judgment. When I expressed concerns about your emotional stability, your fitness to handle the pressures of commercial aviation, he took those concerns seriously." She stepped past me, her polished shoes crunching on a button from my destroyed shirt. "Some people are born to fly, Elena. Others are born to dream about it. The sooner you accept which category you belong to, the easier this will be for everyone." The locker room door swung shut behind her, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my dreams and the growing realization that this wasn't just sibling rivalry. This was something much darker, much more calculated. I gathered the pieces of my uniform, what was left of them, and stuffed them into a plastic bag. The metal wings, those symbols of everything I'd worked for, were nowhere to be found. Victoria had taken them with her, I realized. A trophy of her victory. As I walked toward HR, my legs feeling like they were made of lead, I passed a window that looked out onto the tarmac. Boeing 737s and Airbus A320s sat like sleeping giants, waiting for their crews to bring them to life. In a few hours, Victoria would be in the captain's seat of one of those aircraft, commanding the respect and responsibility I dreamed of my entire life. And I would be, what? A ground crew member. A baggage handler. Another casualty of family politics masquerading as corporate safety. The HR office smelled like coffee and resignation. The walls were covered with motivational posters featuring soaring eagles and inspiring quotes about reaching new heights. Cruel irony for someone whose wings had just been clipped. Mrs. Henderson, the HR director, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair. She'd been sympathetic during my initial hiring process, even mentioning that it was wonderful to see another Martinez joining the Northwest Aviation family. Now she couldn't meet my eyes. "Elena," she said softly, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances." "What circumstances exactly?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like I'm being punished for something I didn't do." Mrs. Henderson sighed, opening a manila folder that I recognized as my personnel file. "We've received reports about incidents during your training period. Concerns about your emotional stability under pressure situations." "What incidents?" I leaned forward. "I passed every evaluation. My simulator scores were excellent. My instructors never mentioned any concerns." "The concerns weren't raised by your instructors," she interrupted gently. "They came from a family member who witnessed some troubling behaviors during your training period." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "A family member?" Mrs. Henderson nodded reluctantly. Captain Martinez felt it was her duty to report what she observed. She was very concerned about potential risks to passenger safety. I sat back in the chair, feeling like I was drowning in quicksand. "And you believed her? Just like that? Without investigating? Without asking for my side of the story?" "Elena, Captain Martinez is one of our most respected pilots. She has an exemplary safety record and 8 years of experience with this company. When someone of her caliber raises concerns about aviation safety, we have to take those concerns seriously, even when those concerns are about her own sister." Mrs. Henderson's expression grew uncomfortable. "Family relationships don't override safety protocols. If anything, the fact that she was willing to jeopardize her relationship with you to protect passengers shows the depth of her professional integrity." Professional integrity. The phrase made me want to laugh and scream at the same time. What Victoria had done wasn't professional integrity. It was character assassination wrapped in corporate policy. "So what happens now?" "Yes. You'll be reassigned to ground operations while we conduct a full evaluation of your fitness for flight duties. If the evaluation comes back positive, we can discuss returning you to pilot training. If not..." She let the sentence hang in the air like a death sentence. "How long does this evaluation take?" 6 to 8 months typically. Sometimes longer if there are complicating factors. 6 to 8 months. In aviation, that might as well be a lifetime. Skills deteriorate, certifications expire, opportunities disappear. Even if I were eventually cleared, and Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested that was unlikely, I'd be starting over from scratch while Victoria continued building her career and her reputation. I stood up slowly, feeling older than my 27 years. "Is there anything else?" Mrs. Henderson reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a temporary ID badge. Instead of the gold pilot designation I dreamed of seeing, it read "Ground Operations" in bold black letters. "Report to Supervisor Martinez in the morning," she said. "He'll show you your new responsibilities." As I walked out of the HR office, I caught a glimpse of Victoria through the glass partition that separated the administrative area from the crew briefing rooms. She was sitting at a conference table with Captain Morrison and 3 other pilots, reviewing flight plans and weather reports. Her posture was confident, authoritative. The posture of someone who belonged in that room. She looked up and our eyes met through the glass. For just a moment, her professional mask slipped, and I saw something unexpected in her expression. Not remorse exactly, but something that might have been uncertainty, regret. Then she turned back to her charts, effectively dismissing me from her attention and her life. I made it to my car before the tears came. 23 years of dreams, shattered in less than an hour. 4 years of education and training worthless. A lifetime of looking up at planes and knowing I belonged among the clouds, reduced to a ground operations badge and a psychological evaluation that felt more like a corporate execution. But as I sat in that parking lot, crying until my eyes burned and my chest ached, something else began growing inside me. Something dark and patient and utterly determined. Victoria thought she'd won. She thought she'd successfully grounded the sister who threatened her position as the family's aviation star. She thought I would disappear quietly, accept my reduced circumstances, and fade into the background like a supporting character in her success story. She was wrong. I started the engine and drove away from Northwest Aviation, but I wasn't driving toward defeat. I was driving toward the beginning of a plan that would take years to execute and require every ounce of intelligence, determination, and ruthlessness I possessed. Victoria had taught me something valuable that morning. That family wasn't sacred. That blood didn't protect you from betrayal. That sometimes the people closest to you were the most dangerous enemies you'd ever face. But she'd also taught me something else, something she probably didn't intend. That power could be taken away as easily as it was given. That reputations could be destroyed as methodically as they were built. That the person who seemed untouchable today might find themselves falling from a very great height tomorrow. I had learned her lessons well. Now it was time to become her teacher. The apartment I moved into after leaving Northwest Aviation was a far cry from the pilot's quarters I'd imagined for myself. A cramped one-bedroom in Seattle's University District. It sat above a used bookstore that smelled perpetually of coffee and old paper. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbor's television, and the heating system made sounds like a dying animal. But it was mine, and more importantly, it was anonymous. For the first 3 months, I worked temporary jobs. Filing insurance claims, answering phones for medical practice, data entry for a law firm. The work was mind-numbing, but it gave me something Victoria's sabotage had taken away. Time to think, plan, and most importantly, to investigate. I spent my evenings in that cramped apartment with my laptop, multiple monitors I'd bought secondhand, and a growing collection of federal aviation regulation manuals, aviation law textbooks, and investigative journalism guides. If Victoria thought she'd broken me, she was going to learn that she'd actually created something much more dangerous. An enemy with time, motivation, and nothing left to lose. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While working data entry at Crawford & Associates law firm, I overheard a conversation between 2 aviation attorneys discussing a case involving pilot misconduct. They mentioned something called the Aviation Safety Reporting System, a confidential database where aviation professionals could report safety concerns without fear of retaliation. That night, I spent 12 hours learning everything I could about aviation oversight systems. The FAA, it turned out, maintained extensive databases of incident reports, safety violations, crew complaints, and personnel actions. Most of these records were confidential, but some were accessible through Freedom of Information Act requests, especially if they involved safety investigations. I started small. Public records requests for Northwest Aviation's safety statistics over the past 10 years. Incident reports involving crew disputes or personnel actions. General information about pilot fitness evaluations and the criteria used to assess aviation professionals. What I found was disturbing. Northwest Aviation had one of the highest rates of pilot turnover in the industry. Not because of poor working conditions or low pay, but because of what the industry euphemistically called personality conflicts with senior crew members. Over the past 5 years, 17 pilots had been reassigned, terminated, or resigned citing conflicts with command staff. 17 pilots. All of them junior to Victoria. All of them potential threats to her position as the company's golden child. I dug deeper, using public record requests and archived news articles to trace the careers of those 17 former pilots. What I found was a pattern that made my blood run cold. Marcus Webb had been a promising first officer until he was reassigned to ground operations following reports of erratic behavior during critical flight phases. The reports had come from his captain, Victoria Martinez. Webb had eventually left commercial aviation entirely and now flew cargo planes for a third-tier freight company. Sarah Kim had been terminated during her probationary period after multiple incidents of insubordination and failure to follow command protocols. Her captain on those flights, Victoria Martinez. Kim was now working as a flight instructor at a small regional airport. Her commercial aviation career effectively over. David Chen had been transferred to another airline following concerns about his decision-making abilities under pressure situations. The concerns had been raised by, you guessed it, Victoria Martinez. Chen had landed on his feet at a smaller carrier, but his advancement had been permanently stunted. The pattern was undeniable. For 8 years, Victoria had been systematically destroying the careers of any pilot who might threaten her position. She'd weaponized the industry's emphasis on safety and teamwork, using corporate protocols and professional courtesy to eliminate competition. And I was just her latest victim. But understanding the pattern was only the first step. If I wanted to bring Victoria down, I needed more than circumstantial evidence and suspicious coincidences. I needed proof, concrete, undeniable documentation of her misconduct. That's when I decided to go back to school. The University of Washington's Aviation Law and Policy program was designed for working professionals who wanted to specialize in aviation regulation, safety oversight, and industry compliance. Classes met in the evenings and on weekends, which meant I could continue working temporary jobs while earning credentials that would give me access to the aviation industry's inner workings. Professor Elena Rodriguez, the irony of sharing a first name wasn't lost on me, was a former FAA investigator who'd spent 15 years investigating aviation incidents and pilot misconduct. She was exactly the kind of mentor I needed. Aviation is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the world, she explained during my first federal aviation regulations class. Every aspect of commercial flight operations is governed by specific rules, documented procedures, and oversight mechanisms. The system works because it assumes that everyone, from ground crew to senior captains, will follow established protocols and report violations when they occur. She paused, looking directly at me as if she could sense the intensity of my attention. But the system also has vulnerabilities. When trusted personnel abuse their authority or manipulate reporting mechanisms, they can cause enormous damage before anyone notices the pattern. After class, I approached her with what I hoped sounded like academic curiosity. Professor Rodriguez, how would someone investigate suspected abuse of authority by a senior pilot? Hypothetically speaking. She studied me for a long moment, her experienced eyes seeming to see straight through my carefully neutral expression. Hypothetically, she said slowly, such an investigation would require extensive documentation, multiple witness statements, and evidence of systematic pattern rather than isolated incidents. The aviation industry protects its senior personnel very carefully. For good reason usually. So accusations of misconduct need to be absolutely bulletproof. What kind of documentation? Flight records, crew reports, maintenance logs, passenger complaints, incident reports. Anything that creates a paper trail of the alleged misconduct. But most importantly, you'd need access to confidential personnel files and internal communications. How would someone get that kind of access? Professor Rodriguez smiled grimly. They'd need to either work for the FAA directly, or find someone who does. That conversation changed everything. I threw myself into the aviation law program with obsessive intensity. Constitutional law as it applied to transportation regulations. Federal oversight mechanisms. Whistleblower protections. Investigative procedures. I studied like my life depended on it because in many ways it did. During my second semester, I wrote a research paper on systematic abuse of authority in commercial aviation. Ostensibly, it was an academic exercise examining historical cases and regulatory responses. In reality, it was a detailed blueprint for building a case against Victoria. Professor Rodriguez was impressed enough to recommend me for an internship with the FAA's Flight Standards District Office. The position was unpaid, but it came with something invaluable: access to internal aviation safety databases and direct contact with federal investigators. My supervisor was a gruff, coffee-addicted investigator named Robert Chen, no relation to the David Chan that Victoria had helped destroy. Chen had been investigating aviation misconduct for 23 years, and he'd seen every variation of corruption, incompetence, and abuse of authority the industry could produce. "You've got good instincts," he told me after reviewing my internship application. "Most people who apply for these positions want to help airlines avoid regulatory problems. You seem more interested in finding the problems in the first place." "I believe aviation safety depends on accountability," I said carefully. "Everyone talks about the importance of reporting safety concerns, but what happens when the reporting system itself is compromised?" Chen's eyes sharpened. "That's a very specific concern. Any particular reason you're interested in that aspect of oversight?" I'd been preparing for this question for months. During my preliminary research, I noticed patterns in some commercial aviation personnel actions that seemed inconsistent with standard safety protocols. "What kind of patterns?" I opened my laptop and showed him the analysis I'd been developing. A statistical breakdown of pilot career trajectories at major carriers, focusing on unexplained reassignments and terminations. Chen studied the data for several minutes, his expression growing more serious as he absorbed the implications. "This is impressive work," he said finally. "Where did you get access to this level of personnel data?" "Public records requests mostly. Industry publications. Some of the information is available if you know where to look and how to analyze it systematically." "And you think this pattern suggests systematic abuse of reporting mechanisms?" "I think it suggests that someone with authority is using safety protocols to eliminate competition, rather than address legitimate safety concerns." Chen was quiet for a long moment, staring at my laptop screen. Then he looked up at me with a kind of expression that suggested he was reassessing everything he thought he knew about my motivations. "Martinez," he said slowly, "there's something you should know about this kind of investigation. Once you start pulling threads, you can't control how far the unraveling goes. If you're right about systematic abuse, it's going to destroy careers, relationships, and reputations. People are going to get hurt, including people who might not deserve it." I met his gaze steadily. "People are already getting hurt. They're just suffering quietly, individually, without anyone connecting the dots. And you want to be the one who connects those dots." "I want to be the one who makes sure the system works the way it's supposed to." Chin nodded slowly. "Okay. Let's talk about how to do this properly." That conversation was the real beginning of my education in aviation justice. Over the following months, Chen taught me how to navigate federal databases, how to interpret personnel records, how to identify patterns of misconduct that might be invisible to casual observation. More importantly, he taught me patience. "Building a case like this takes years," he explained during one of our regular review sessions. "You need multiple sources of evidence, corroborating testimony from witnesses, and documentation that can withstand legal challenges. Rush the process, and your target will have time to cover their tracks and discredit your evidence." I spent 18 months as an unpaid intern, learning the intricate machinery of aviation oversight while slowly, methodically building a file on Victoria's career. Every flight she commanded, every crew evaluation she submitted, every personnel recommendation she made. All of it went into a database I maintained with obsessive care. The picture that emerged was even worse than I'd suspected. Victoria hadn't just destroyed the careers of pilots she saw as threats. She'd created a hostile work environment that affected dozens of aviation professionals over nearly a decade. Flight attendants who'd requested transfers to avoid her flights. Ground crew members who'd filed informal complaints about her treatment of personnel. Maintenance staff who'd documented her attempts to pressure them into signing off on aircraft inspections without proper review. She'd turned her position as a senior captain into a personal fiefdom, ruling through intimidation and manipulation while maintaining the facade of professionalism that protected her from oversight. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source: Victoria herself. Federal regulations require all cockpit conversations during commercial flights to be recorded and archived for safety analysis. Most of these recordings are routine, capturing standard communications between pilots and air traffic control. But occasionally, they capture moments when pilots think no one is listening. During my third semester of law school, I gained access to archived cockpit voice recordings as part of a research project on communication protocols during emergency situations. What I found in Victoria's recordings was a goldmine of evidence. "Jesus Christ, this first officer is useless." Victoria's voice came through clearly in a recording from 18 months earlier. "Can't handle simple turbulence without calling for assistance. I'm going to recommend him for additional training. If he's lucky." The first officer she was referring to was Michael Santos, a 26-year-old pilot who'd been transferred to ground operations 3 weeks after that flight. Santos had eventually left Northwest Aviation after being told his performance concerns made him unsuitable for commercial aviation. Another recording captured Victoria discussing a flight attendant who'd apparently challenged one of her decisions. "Some people don't understand the chain of command. I'll make sure she understands her place before this flight is over." The flight attendant, Lisa Park, had filed a formal complaint about hostile treatment from flight crew. The complaint had been dismissed after Victoria submitted a report questioning Park's professionalism and reliability. Recording after recording revealed the same pattern: Victoria using her authority to humiliate, intimidate, and ultimately destroy anyone who threatened her position or questioned her judgment. But the most damaging recording was one where Victoria didn't know the cockpit voice recorder was still active during a post-flight discussion with another captain. "The Martinez girl thinks she can just walk into my airline and take over." Victoria's voice was clear and cold. "She's always been emotional, unstable. Our parents babied her, made her think she was special. But this industry doesn't reward emotional weakness." "She's your sister," the other captain had replied. "She's competition," Victoria had responded without hesitation. "And I didn't spend 8 years building my reputation just to watch my little sister undermine it with her panic attacks and her victim mentality. You really think she's that unstable?" Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless. "I know exactly how unstable she is. I've been documenting it for months. Every mistake, every moment of uncertainty, every sign that she's not ready for the responsibility of commercial aviation. When the time comes, I'll have everything I need to ground her permanently." The recording was dated 3 weeks before my first scheduled flight. 3 weeks before Victoria had shredded my uniform and destroyed my career. She hadn't acted impulsively or out of sudden jealousy. She'd been planning my destruction for months. Listening to that recording, hearing my own sister discuss my professional elimination with clinical detachment, something crystallized inside me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This wasn't even just about justice for me personally. This was about stopping a predator who'd been allowed to operate with impunity for too long. I copied every relevant recording, every personnel file, every incident report I could access through my internship. I documented patterns, established timelines, and prepared witness lists of everyone Victoria had harmed over her 8-year reign of terror. By my 4th semester, I had enough evidence to destroy her career 10 times over. But Chen had taught me patience, and patience meant waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It meant being absolutely certain that when I pulled the trigger, the shot would be fatal and irreversible. That moment came when I received an email that made my blood run cold. "Elena Martinez has been accepted into the Federal Aviation Administration's Accelerated Inspector Training Program. Congratulations on joining the federal oversight community." I was going from intern to federal investigator. I was going from victim to prosecutor. It was time to bring Victoria home. The federal building that housed the FAA's regional office was a monument to bureaucratic authority. All concrete and glass, designed to intimidate people who thought they could operate outside regulatory oversight. Walking through its security checkpoints with my new federal investigator credentials felt like stepping into a different universe, one where I held the kind of power Victoria had always wielded against others. My first assignment was a routine compliance audit at Cascade Regional Airlines, a small carrier that operated turboprop aircraft throughout the Pacific Northwest. It was exactly the kind of unglamorous work that newly minted federal investigators typically received. Necessary but unlikely to make headlines or advance careers. But I wasn't interested in advancing my career. I was interested in learning how the federal oversight system worked from the inside, understanding its strengths and vulnerabilities, and positioning myself for the day when I would need to wield its full authority against my sister. That day came sooner than expected. Robert Chen knocked on my office door 3 months after I'd started my new position, holding a manila folder that he placed carefully on my desk. "We've got a situation at Northwest Aviation," he said without preamble. Multiple anonymous complaints filed through the aviation safety reporting system, all citing the same senior captain for crew intimidation, abuse of authority, and systematic harassment of junior personnel. My heart started racing, but I kept my expression neutral. How many complaints? 7 in the past 6 months. All filed by different crew members. Pilots, flight attendants, ground personnel. All describing similar patterns of behavior from the same individual. Chen opened the folder and slid a document across my desk. At the top of the page, in bold block letters, was a name I knew better than my own. Captain Victoria Martinez. The complaints describe systematic career sabotage, hostile work environment, and abuse of safety reporting mechanisms to eliminate perceived threats, Chen continued. The pattern is consistent with the research you did during your internship. I looked up at him, trying to read his expression. Are you assigning this investigation to me? That depends. Can you handle investigating someone you know personally? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Chen knew about my family connection to Victoria. Federal background investigations are thorough, and he'd certainly discovered that we shared a last name and a hometown. What he didn't know was the full extent of our history, the personal nature of my interest in her downfall. I can be objective, I said carefully. If anything, my familiarity with Northwest Aviation's operations and personnel might be an advantage. Chen studied me for a long moment. This isn't about settling personal scores, Martinez. Federal investigations have to be absolutely clean, completely defensible. Any hint that you're pursuing a personal vendetta, and the entire case gets thrown out. I understand. Do you? Because once we open this investigation, there's no going back. If Captain Martinez is guilty of the misconduct described in these complaints, her career is over. Permanently. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? I met his gaze steadily. Are you prepared to let her continue destroying people's careers if she's not stopped? Chen nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with my response. All right. You're lead investigator. But I'm supervising every step of this process, and at the first sign that your judgment is compromised, I'm pulling you off the case. Understood. Understood. After Chen left, I opened the folder and began reading the complaints that would finally give me the weapon I needed to destroy Victoria's career. The first complaint came from Marcus Webb, the first officer who'd been reassigned to ground operations after Victoria reported him for erratic behavior. Captain Martinez created a hostile environment from my first day on her crew. She questioned every decision I made, criticized my performance in front of passengers, and deliberately scheduled me for the most challenging routes to set me up for failure. When I requested reassignment to another captain, she told me that running from criticism would follow me throughout my career. 3 days later, I was called to HR and told I was being reassigned due to performance concerns that she had documented over several months. The second complaint was from Sarah Kim, whose commercial aviation career had been ended by Victoria's reports of insubordination. Captain Martinez made it clear from our first meeting that she didn't think I belonged in commercial aviation. She made comments about my age, my experience level, and my gender that would have been actionable in any other workplace. When I tried to address her behavior through proper channels, she filed reports claiming I was insubordinate and unable to accept authority. My career ended before it really began because one person decided I didn't deserve to fly. 7 complaints, 7 destroyed careers, 7 people who'd been powerless to fight back against Victoria's systematic abuse. But now they weren't powerless. Now they had a federal investigator who understood exactly what Victoria was capable of, and who had the authority to hold her accountable. I spent the next 2 weeks reviewing personnel files, incident reports, and crew evaluations related to Victoria's flights over the past 5 years. The pattern of abuse was undeniable, and more extensive than even I had realized. Victoria hadn't just targeted potential competitors. She'd gone after anyone who challenged her authority, questioned her decisions, or simply annoyed her on a bad day. Her position as a senior captain gave her enormous power over the careers of junior personnel, and she'd wielded that power with ruthless efficiency. More damaging still were the cockpit voice recordings I'd discovered during my internship. Federal regulations made those recordings admissible as evidence in misconduct investigations, and Victoria's own words would provide the most compelling proof of her systematic abuse. But building the case was only half the battle. I also needed to make sure Victoria couldn't sabotage the investigation the way she'd sabotaged so many careers. That's where my knowledge of her psychology became crucial. Victoria's strength had always been her ability to control information and manipulate perceptions. She was a master at presenting herself as the reasonable professional party while portraying her victims as emotional, unstable, or incompetent. She'd used those tactics against me and dozens of others over the years.